My wife left the entire chain of grocery stores in control of everything to our son, and all I got was a dilapidated old canning factory. That night when I got home, he looked at the rusty key in my hand and said, "Go enjoy your rusty museum, old man. Stay there and cook soup for the rest of your life." I drove for hours before standing in front of it with nowhere to go. I opened the door, thinking there would be nothing inside. But the moment my flashlight beam reached the end of the room, I froze. The wind off the Ohio River doesn't ask permission when it rolls through West End come September. It just arrives cold, indifferent cutting. It found me straight through the old flannel jacket I'd pulled on the morning of Sylvia's funeral. Well, 3 weeks back now, and hadn't once peeled off since. I wasn't sure I ever would. Some things you wear because you can't figure out how to stop. Welcome to Father's Silent Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If these stories of love loss and quiet justice speak to you, it means a great deal when you like this video and subscribe so we can keep bringing them to you. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from right now and what time it is there. There's something that feels right about knowing people are hearing this story at all hours in all kinds of places. A note before we start: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it well. Any resemblance to specific real persons or events is coincidental. It's the truth at the heart of it that matters. 20 minutes before midnight, I was on South Halsted Street, facing a building whose existence I hadn't known about until 9 hours prior, a rusted key leaving orange smears across my palm. 67 years old. No other place to be. The Rusty Can. That was the name on the deed. A cannery warehouse at 1614 Lynn Street, raised sometime in the 1940s, sitting between a shuttered tile warehouse and a chain-link fence with a hand-painted sign warning trespassers in both English and German. The brick exterior was the color of old clay, darkened by decades of coal smoke. The loading dock had been sealed with plywood, long enough that the boards had buckled and cracked apart. Wire mesh gone, the gray of old pewter covered two of the front windows. My son had called it a rusty museum. Standing there in the dark, I thought he'd been charitable. I hadn't intended to come here tonight. After Alvin Good's office, after Hyde Park, after everything I'd driven 3 hours without any fixed destination, just circling the way you keep moving when going, still feels like going under. Cincinnati churned on around me, the expressways, the late-night diners lit up yellow at the edges, the wet asphalt catching the orange of the street lamps. I'd arrived here the way a river arrives at a low place, not by choice but by gravity. My mind kept pulling back to that morning. Alvin Good, who'd handled our family's legal affairs for more than 2 decades, had welcomed us into his office on 4th Street, wearing the measured look of a man who'd been handed bad news to deliver and had made his peace with it. 2 chairs placed facing his desk. Clifford had been there when I walked in, already settled, already wearing that expression he reserved for negotiations, focused, giving nothing away. Alvin's voice, as he read the will, was unhurried and flat, and somehow the flatness made every sentence hit harder. To my son, Clifford Varden, I leave full ownership and operational control of Miller's Express, including all subsidiary holdings, contracts, distribution agreements, and brand assets. That part I'd half expected. Sylvia had poured herself into building Miller's Express, but she'd said more than once that Clifford was the one who understood the business side of things, that I didn't. She wasn't wrong. I was a cook. Heat and timing and the honest transformation of raw things into something worth eating, that was my fluency. The language of corporate structure had always been foreign to me. Then Alvin cleared his throat. To my husband, Eugene Varden, I leave the property located at 1614 Lynn Street, known as the Rusty Can, and all contents therein. Clifford didn't flinch. He reached across and set his hand on my arm for a moment, a gesture that had the shape of comfort and none of its substance. Alvin pushed a small envelope across the desk. 1 key, plain steel ring. I turned it between my fingers while Alvin went through the transfer details. The property, the taxes, the schedule. Most of it passed through me without sticking. I kept staring at the corrosion on that key, turning over the question of whether Sylvia had ever spoken of this place. She hadn't. Not a word in 42 years. The ride back to Hyde Park was silent. Clifford said nothing. I didn't ask. I'd spent the whole day telling myself this was shock, that sorrow distorts things. That morning would bring some clarity. Evening came and brought none. Clifford carried one of my bags in himself. I took that as a hopeful sign. Then he put it down in the entryway, just the one, and turned toward me, hands buried in his pockets. I need the house Dad's starting this week. I'm bringing in a full restructuring team for the business, and I need the space to work properly. I stood there a beat, not quite catching up. This is my home, Clifford. I've lived here 15 years. It was Mom's home. He said it without sharpness, without evident malice, which made it land heavier than anger would have. It's in the estate now, and I'm the estate. I've already arranged for your personal effects to be boxed up by end of week. Anything you want before then, you should take tonight. I asked where that left me. His eyes went to the key. You've got the warehouse. I left you the family museum, old man. Go enjoy your rusty can. Cook your soup there till the end of your days. The words came out smooth, the tone of a man saying something he'd already rehearsed past any emotion. Not bitter, not triumphant. Simply done. As though I were an entry in a ledger he'd finally balanced. I picked up my bag. I took the chef's knives wrapped in the canvas rolls Sylvia had given me on our 20th anniversary. I lifted the photograph from the hallway, the two of us outside our first restaurant, a hand-painted sign above us 1988. Sylvia mid-laugh at something I'd just said. Me with my eyes on her, not on the camera. I left without a word. So did he. Now I was on Lynn Street, the wind working through my jacket, the key in my fist, and 42 years of living condensed to this, a corroded lock on a building I'd never laid eyes on, tucked into a part of the city I barely recognized. On the worst night of my adult life, I pressed the key into the lock. My hand was trembling, and it had nothing to do with cold. The mechanism pushed back, then relented, the tumblers shifting with a sound like something small and brittle finding its place. The iron door opened inward, its hinges protesting as though the disturbance were an offense. I moved inside and swept the flashlight across the space. Dust rose and turned in the beam like it had intention. Forms materialized out of the dark, hulking equipment, under a skin of shadow. Crates, stacked in rows, the bare metal bones of industrial shelving stretching wall to wall. Then the smell reached me. Machine oil. Rust. And beneath those, something else older, harder to place, something the dark had been keeping to itself. For a moment I nearly went back, nearly stepped out into the Cincinnati night and put miles between myself and this place until the road ran out. That would have been the gravest error I ever made because my flashlight beam still hadn't touched the far wall. I didn't turn. My legs carried me deeper, not from any resolve, but because there was simply no other direction left. The staircase registered every pound of me. Each step let out a long wooden complaint, the sound of a structure that had gone unspoken to for a very long time. My hand closed on the iron railing, and rust broke away in flakes, printing an orange line across my palm. 67 years old, inside a building that looked about as worn as I felt, with no clear idea what I thought I'd find up there. The upper floor received me like a room exhaling after a long-held breath. It ran farther than I'd anticipated. The ceiling climbed higher, braced by steel beams crossing the full length like the exposed ribs of something prehistoric and long since gone. 3 skylights overhead, filthy thick with grime, pressed moonlight down in pale, uneven slabs across the concrete below. Dust drifted through those cold columns of light, patient and unhurried, as though settling were something it had given up on long ago. And then the machines came into focus. 6 of them arranged in a line down the far wall, each one standing roughly chest-high, their surfaces, that flat industrial gray you see in 100 commercial kitchens. Seaming machines, the old rotary kind with the double seam head and the chain drive running underneath. I hadn't encountered that model since the early 1980s, back when every mid-scale food operation in the Midwest still relied on them before pneumatic systems swept in and stripped the work of whatever slow humanity it had once carried. I crossed to the nearest one, laid my hand along its side panel. Cold and dense, the kind of solidity built before manufacturers figured out that thinner was more profitable. Near the base, a small plate was bolted to the metal. I angled the flashlight down. Kellner Industrial, Series 4B, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1902. I went completely still. Sylvia had purchased a Kellner Series 4B in the spring of 1992. I knew because I'd been there, the two of us muscling the thing into a rented truck one Saturday morning, the Cincinnati wind cold enough to sting the eyes. She'd been radiant with pride over it. "This is how we scale," she'd told me, giving the side of the machine an affectionate pat. "This is how we stop being small." Miller's Express grew from 12 accounts to 40 that same year. I moved back from the machine and felt something loosen and resettle inside my chest. Not quite grief, something adjacent to it, something that presses in from just behind where grief lives. The sense of a thing rising you aren't prepared to face yet. A moment later, the smell came at me again, old metal oil, long since dried out the faint trace of something sharp and chemical that had once been used to clean the place. It wasn't a bad smell. It was specific the way certain smells are not the kind that evoke a broad category, but a single precise moment. I was back in the kitchen on Freeman Avenue, 1981 autumn, renting the bottom floor of a two-flat. 600 square feet, one window in the kitchen, a stove with only 2 working burners. Sylvia had taken over the entire counter with her jars and bottles, and the small canning rig she'd assembled from parts sourced across 3 different suppliers. The whole apartment carried the smell of reduction sauces and herbs, and I'd trained myself to sleep through the sound of lids sealing at 2:00 in the morning. I remember standing in the doorway watching her one night, her back-to-me hair pinned up shoulders, moving with the quiet intensity of someone entirely absorbed, unaware of being observed. She was adding something to the pot. I asked what. She didn't turn around. "Basil," she said. "Add more basil, Eugene. Always more basil than you think you need." I'd written it down afterward in a notebook I kept for her food advice, because I'd understood by then that Sylvia's instructions about cooking were almost never only about cooking. I drew myself back to the present. The row of Kellner machines stood silent. 6 of them. Same model, same year. This was no accident, no forgotten relic left behind. Someone had gathered these here with purpose. Someone had known exactly what they were and what they signified. I moved along the wall to the far corner where the moonlight gave out. My flashlight landed on a desk, heavy wood, the kind of office furniture built to last a lifetime, and that usually made good on the promise. It sat against the wall, as though placed there with intention rather than pushed aside in haste. On its surface lay a stack of notebooks, their covers buckled and swollen from years of damp air. I lifted the top one and turned to the first page. The handwriting was small, forward slanting, and I knew it before I'd consciously registered what I was looking at. That hand had written grocery lists and birthday cards and margin notes in cookbooks for 42 years. But the name on the inside cover wasn't Miller's Express. I didn't recognize it. I read it twice to be certain. I set the notebook down with the care you use when you suspect an object's meaning might shift depending on how you handle it. That was when my foot caught on something uneven. I looked down, a seam in the concrete rectangular and deliberate about 2 feet by 3. I crouched, traced the edge with my fingers, and felt the metal plate set into the floor beneath. A fine layer of grime sat flush with the surface, nearly invisible. Nearly. A small iron ring, folded flat, was set into one end. I hooked 2 fingers through and pulled. The plate swung up on old protesting hinges, and a column of dark air rose from the opening. Then the smell arrived slowly, at first, then in a rush. Vinegar and aged wine, and something warm beneath both of them, something I had no word for but recognized in a part of myself older than language. It was the smell of patience, of time given to something with deliberate care, of a decision made decades ago that was only now fulfilling itself. Whatever was down there had been sitting in that darkness for a very long time. I stood at the edge of the opening for nearly a full minute before I made myself descend. 67 years old bad knees crouched over a hidden hatch in an abandoned warehouse at midnight. Sylvia always had a way of drawing me into things I'd never have attempted on my own. She'd been doing it for 42 years. Apparently she wasn't finished. The ladder was iron bolted into the wall, each rung cold and exact under my palms. I went slowly, testing each step before committing my weight the way you learn to move when your body has become something that requires negotiation. The smell thickened as I descended that layered combination of vinegar and wine and something older underneath, sealed from air and light and ordinary time long enough to develop its own private atmosphere. My foot found the floor. I turned around. The lights came on by themselves. A strip of LED sensors ran low along the ceiling. Motion activated, I understood, triggered by my movement. They woke one section at a time, like a theater being lit before a performance, and what they revealed made me reach back for the ladder, just to have something solid to hold. The cellar ran the full length of the building above. I hadn't anticipated that. The ceiling was low, but the room was long, 80 feet perhaps, and every foot of it was in use. Chestnut barrels lined the walls in stacked rows of 4, each one, sealed, each one tagged with a small label, tied with waxed linen cord. Between the barrel rows, wooden shelving held glass-sealed containers of varying sizes, their contents dark or amber, or the deep rust red of something that had spent years becoming what it now was. I walked forward because standing still was beyond me. The floor was clean. Not recently cleaned. Cleaned long ago with clear intention, then sealed. Temperature controlled. I noticed the air down here was different from the warehouse above. Stable, still. The kind of air that costs money to maintain, and someone had been paying to maintain it. For how long I couldn't say. I stopped at the nearest barrel and read the label. Aceto balsamico tradizionale. Age 40 years batch, 7 of 12. Origin Modena acquisition, 1983. I worked through the numbers, 1983 plus 40 years. The balsamic in this barrel had been aging since the year Sylvia and I bought our first house. Since the year Clifford was born. Since the year Sylvia told me quietly over breakfast one morning that she thought she finally understood what she was building, and that it would take longer than either of us could see clearly from where we were standing. I walked the full length of the room. The barrels gave way to shelving, and the shelving held sealed glass containers of saffron proper, saffron Persian, grade the kind that costs more per gram than most people spend on a meal. Alongside them were bottles bearing handwritten labels, reduction bases, aged wine stocks, infused oils that had been processing long enough to turn colors I had no names for. At the far end of the cellar, fixed to the wall, was a pegboard. Hanging from it was an inventory sheet, laminated, filled out in handwriting I recognized, without needing to think about it. I unclipped it and held it under the nearest LED strip. Everything was itemized quantities, sources, estimated current market values, and a date of last update. I had to look at that date twice. March 2023, 6 months before Sylvia died. She had come down here in March, already sick, already knowing what she knew. I read the total at the bottom of the page, and my free hand found the nearest shelf without my directing it. My fingers wrapped around the edge of the wood, and I stood there, inventory sheet in one hand, the number still burning in my vision as if it had been pressed there with a brand. $12.4 million. The smell of saffron reached me then, or perhaps it had always been there, and I'd only just let it through. Delicate and mineral and faintly sweet. The smell of patience, of something worth the wait. And I was back in our kitchen on a November evening, 1990, our anniversary, the second one we'd spent in the Indian Hill house. Sylvia was at the stove stirring risotto, and the kitchen held the smell of saffron and white wine and butter and the particular warmth of a room cooked in with love for years. Enough to carry it in the walls. She glanced over her shoulder and caught me watching. "This," she said, gesturing toward the pot with her wooden spoon, "this is the thing that makes all the hard parts worth it, Eugene. Not the money, not the contracts. This right here, a thing made slowly, made well made, for someone." I kissed her on the back of the head and reached for a taste from the pot, and she swatted my hand away and laughed. I hadn't heard that laugh in 4 months. I pulled myself back. The inventory sheet was still in my hand. $12.4 million. Not in a bank, not in a brokerage account. Here underground in barrels and jars and sealed containers, assembled across 40 years, by a woman who knew that the most valuable things are always the ones built slowly and quietly out of sight. I moved along the far wall, and then I stopped. Tucked between 2 barrel stacks resting on a low wooden shelf, as though it had always been there and always expected to be found, was a small iron safe, no larger than a shoebox. Its body was black and plain, the kind of thing you could carry under one arm. But the lock was not plain. The lock was a padlock in the shape of a heart. Brass, small. Age had pulled the color down to something close to a worn penny, but the silhouette was one I'd have known anywhere. I recognized this lock. I'd picked it up from a hardware store on Reading Road in the summer of 1980, before Sylvia and I were officially anything to each other, when I was still too frightened to say out loud what I felt. I'd offered it as a kind of deflection, a joke with a true thing underneath it. "To keep your secret safe," I'd told her. She'd laughed, shaken her head, dropped it into her bag. I'd figured it was gone from her memory before the week was out. She had held on to it for 43 years, carried it here, used it. I got down on one knee and pressed a single finger to the face of that brass heart, cold to the touch. There was a particular heft to it, the heft of an object that has passed through someone's hands many times and been set back down with care. Sylvia never discarded anything that meant something. Not the padlock, not the formulas, not any of it, and not, it seemed, even her last intentions. I stayed kneeling there for a long time, and for the first time since the morning Clifford had stood in the middle of our living room and spoken the words that dismantled everything I'd assumed was solid. What I felt was not purely pain. Something else had moved in alongside it. I couldn't name it yet, but it was there. The key was precisely where I knew before I consciously knew it would be. I can't explain how that kind of recognition operates. Not a deduction. More like the body remembering something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. The way an arm extends toward a light switch in a room you've lived in so long, the motion happens before the thought. I had put on the black vest for Sylvia's funeral 8 days back. Stood at the front of St. Francis de Sales, hands laced together, jaw tight. Attention drifted somewhere outside that hour entirely, because being genuinely present for it was not something I was able to manage. I'd worn the vest home afterward and draped it over the bedroom door and left it untouched. But Sylvia had selected that vest herself, laid it across the bed 2 weeks before she died, already pressed. She had never in 42 years of marriage done that for any other occasion. I went back up to the main floor, retrieved my jacket from the workbench where I'd left it. The vest was folded beneath it. I turned back the left cuff and found the inner seam, the one a tailor uses when something is meant not to be noticed, and felt the thin leather cord there before I saw it. Wound twice secured in the same knot she always used on her apron strings. The key was brass and small, and when I brought it to the heart-shaped lock, it met it the way two things meet when they were made for each other. The shackle released without protest, as though it had simply been resting. Inside the iron safe, laid out with the precise and deliberate orderliness that marked everything Sylvia ever arranged, were 5 bound folders. Each one carried a cover sheet from the United States Patent and Trademark Office Utility patent filings, registered under Sylvia Elaine Varden, each covering a proprietary formulation I could identify from the description alone, without ever seeing the formula itself. The reduction base, the aged balsamic concentrate, the saffron emulsification process, the spice-layered stock, the herb oil infusion that had been the bedrock of Miller's Express from the beginning. She had secured these patents in private, without a word to me, without a trace of them in any business document I had ever reviewed. They belonged to her, not to Miller's Express, not to the company, not to Clifford, to her and to no one else. Next to the folders sat a sealed envelope. The return address read, Adele Whitcomb, Dillard and Associates Attorneys at Law, Cincinnati, Ohio. Adele Whitcomb, I would eventually come to understand, was the attorney Sylvia had retained on her own, a separate engagement, entirely apart from the firm that handled Miller's Express, 18 months before she passed. The envelope bore Sylvia's handwriting on the front, for Eugene, read last. Lying beneath it was a folded piece of paper in the same hand. Read the letter last. Open the bottom drawer first. I looked down. There was a second compartment in the safe, a shallow drawer fitted into the base machine, so flush against the surrounding metal that I'd walked right past it. I drew the small handle toward me, and it came open. Inside, folded in white silk tissue paper, was an apron. Brown leather edges worn soft, the ties replaced at least twice over the years. Along the lower left of the front panel, barely visible, was the ghost of a sauce stain I remembered precisely. 1992. A reduction I'd leaned too far over the ladle, going sideways. I had believed this apron was gone. In 1997, when the catering side moved to a bigger space in Norwood, I'd written it off, assumed it had gone out with a box of old equipment I'd always meant to sort through and never quite got to. I'd let myself mourn it in the small private way you mourn objects that don't seem worth mentioning briefly without ceremony, then set aside. Sylvia had held onto it for 26 years. Tucked into the front pocket was a note, half a page, her handwriting as controlled as it always was, even in the months when the medication had made her hands unreliable for nearly everything else. "You built all of this with these hands, Eugene. Don't let anyone, not even our son, tell you otherwise." I lowered myself to the cellar floor and sat. I don't know exactly how much time went by. The LED strips kept their low hum overhead. The chestnut barrels stood in their rows, patient and full of decades. I held the apron against my chest and wept the way I had not permitted myself since the hospice nurse came through the door to tell me it was finished. Not the careful, managed kind of grief that knows it has an audience. Something raw rising from a place below the ribs, requiring no permission, indifferent to whether anyone heard. When it ran its course, I felt emptied out, but differently from how grief empties you. Lighter. Stripped to the floor. Clean. I unsealed Adele Whitcomb's envelope. 12 pages single-spaced, printed on stiff professional letterhead. I read every word of it, still seated on the floor, the apron spread across my legs, my back against the barrel rack. I read through the remaining darkness, and into the thin gray seep of early morning that eventually found its way down through the warehouse above. Every clause, every contingency, every quiet arrangement Sylvia had constructed across 18 months, while she was ill, while she was dying, while Clifford was busy drawing up plans she was not meant to be aware of. She had been aware of all of it. The letter's final paragraph was not in legal prose. It appeared in the margin, handwritten, a postscript in her own hand. I knew the slant of those letters. She always believed I was the clever one between us. She was wrong about that. I refolded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. When I finally climbed the ladder out of the cellar, morning light was already shouldering through the skylights, catching the suspended dust and turning it gold. I stopped and let it rest on my face for a moment. I had walked into this building the night before with nothing to my name except the weight of a man who'd been told he was finished. I was walking out carrying something I hadn't felt since the last time Sylvia had pressed her palm against my face and held it there, that solid, quiet, unmistakable weight of being loved by someone who had already thought of everything, including this, including now. The light through those skylights cut across the warehouse floor at an angle that made the dust seem almost worth looking at. 8 hours I'd been inside. My back ached from sitting on the cellar floor. My eyes felt worked over from the inside. I was 67 years old, down to perhaps 40 minutes of sleep across the past 24 hours, and I could not recall ever feeling more completely awake. I was still holding the inventory packet, the one I'd found beside the patent folders, in the safe. 12 pages in Sylvia's handwriting, itemized to the last detail, and there at the top of the first page, above all the columns and line items and notations about acquisition dates, was a phone number written in blue ink. Below it, 7 words: "Call him first. He'll explain what I forgot to write down." I checked my watch. 6:43 in the morning. I stared at the number. Then I dialed it. 2 rings. "Mr. Varden," the voice said. Not a question, not quite a greeting. Something closer to the sound of a man who has been holding a place open and is now stepping aside to let you through. "I've been waiting for your call since September 1st. Reed Callum came through the door of the Rusty Can at 8:55. Mid-60s, compact and unhurried, with the kind of face that has spent a long time outdoors and made peace with it. Canvas jacket, a battered leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His handshake at the warehouse entrance was the kind that conveys what it means to without adding anything extra. Part of me had braced for someone from a firm tailored jacket, leather case, the clipped vocabulary of due diligence. Reed was nothing like that. He carried himself the way men do who've logged real hours in industrial spaces and can read a room full of inventory the way others read a newspaper. Sylvia had tracked him down through the specialty food import network she'd run with since the early 90s. A commodity consultant, 20 years working with the Cincinnati Mercantile Exchange before he'd crossed over into private valuation of high-value perishable and aged food assets. 3 visits to the Rusty Can over the past 2 years, each one at Sylvia's request. She knew precisely what she wanted on record, he told me as we went down the ladder into the cellar, and she knew just as precisely what she wanted kept inside these 4 walls. The LED strips flickered on the way they had before. Reed moved among the barrel rows with the unhurried ease of a man retracing familiar ground, lifting a label here, pressing a thumb to a seal there. There was something almost reverent in how he handled the space. She had a name for it, he said. Her insurance policy. Not for her own sake. For yours. He laid it out piece by piece the way a patient instructor builds a case, anchoring me first in what was visible, then drawing out what it was worth. The 40-year aged balsamic, he said, was Consorzio, certified, Aceto, Balsamico Tradizionale from Modena. Authentic, not the industrial stand-in that fills most American shelves. 12 barrels each, holding roughly 10 liters of finished product. Benchmarked against European auction records and contracts with New York luxury food distributors. Each liter ran between $800 and $200 per liter for verified 40-year stock. He rested his portfolio on one of the barrels and spread the comparable sales figures where I could see them. I'd already run the numbers in my head before he finished. The saffron was Persian origin grade 1, held in nitrogen seal containers, sourced through an importer Sylvia had relied on since 1988. That provenance and storage quality, Reed explained, put it between $3,000 and $5,000 per pound on the specialty commodity market. Over 20 years, Sylvia had built up 64 pounds of inventory, adding slowly cycling out older stock, the kind of methodical accumulation that belongs to someone who had mapped the endpoint from the beginning. Then there were the wine reduction stocks, the aged herb oils, the proprietary base concentrates. Each one carried its own valuation framework, and Reed moved through them all at a deliberate pace, fielding questions I hadn't yet known enough to raise. At the far wall of the cellar, he stopped and turned. Every visit, he said, she'd bring you up. No sentiment in the way he said it, more like stating weather. She'd rest her hand on a barrel and say, Eugene's hands made this possible. Not the business side, not the contracts. You in the kitchen, the flavor profiles you developed, that she built the formulations around. A pause settled between us. She said you had no idea. She said she wished she'd told you more often. I fixed my gaze on the chestnut barrel closest to me and let the silence hold. Back upstairs in the flat gray light of the warehouse, Reed laid his portfolio open on Sylvia's old desk. 4 categories each, backed by documentation, everything ordered and spare. The total at the bottom matched the figure I'd stared at the night before on Sylvia's handwritten inventory sheet, $12.4 million of seller assets only. But Reed's version came with CME-referenced commodity pricing auction comparables, distributor, contract data, and that changed the texture of the number entirely. In Sylvia's hand, it had felt like something hidden. Set down in Reed's format, it felt like something settled. I let that sit for a beat. How solid are these numbers, I asked. Understated, he said. I held the estimates low. Depending on the buyer and the structure of the sale, the balsamic alone has room to run higher. He drew the portfolio shut and met my eyes without looking away. Sylvia didn't want you second-guessing any of this. She wanted figures you could actually build from. I nodded slow. Beyond the corrugated walls, Cincinnati was behaving the way it does in mid-September. Sky low and luminous, the wind off the Ohio River, already carrying that first cold thread of the season. Traffic sounds filtered through from East 4th Street, the city's ordinary pulse. Keep in mind that's only what's down here, Reed said, nudging the portfolio my direction across the desk. There's considerably more to see above ground. He shrugged on his jacket and watched me with the easy patience of someone confident in what comes next. What do you say we pay Adele Whitcomb a visit this afternoon? Adele Whitcomb kept her office on the 22nd floor of a glass tower on East 4th Street, the Loop, where Cincinnati's downtown pushes its face toward the sky, and the river light falls across the facades at an angle that lends everything a false sense of permanence. 40 years in this city, and I had never occupied a room that felt quite like this. Everything in it had been chosen to say the same thing. The person at that desk has navigated worse than whatever you're carrying, and navigated it well. Reed drove us. He kept quiet most of the way, which I was grateful for. My night had been spent in the warehouse, loosely speaking. 2 hours on a cot Reed had turned up in the back before he collected me the following afternoon for the drive downtown. 2 hours of sleep, and beneath that, the low-grade electricity of a man still absorbing the fact that the woman he'd buried had been in ways he'd never suspected far more capable than he had ever given her room to be. Adele was a surprise. 60 or close to it, silver hair, and a quality of attention so still and complete that each thing you said felt immediately catalogued. She came around the desk when I entered, clasped my hand in both of hers, and said, "Mr. Varden, Sylvia spoke of you a great deal. I've had the feeling for some time that I already knew you. No flourish, just the plain statement. I didn't doubt it." She drew a flat tube from a cabinet and unrolled a large format map across the conference table, the kind cartographers produce for city planners, showing every parcel edge and tax ID. The West End neighborhood south Cincinnati Riverside, the old industrial belt that had been shifting under pressure for a decade as outside money moved in, and the people who'd always lived there pushed back. She positioned a pen over the block that held the rusty can. Then down came the colored markers. One by one, 7 parcels in total, a cluster angled to the north, 2 running east along the rail corridor, another 2 bracketing the block's south approach. Sylvia began acquiring them in 2016, Adele said. Each purchase was routed through a distinct LLC, West End Holdings 1 through 7. Every one of those LLCs sits inside the Varden Family Living Trust, put in place in 2018. She held my gaze from across the table. As of Sylvia's death, you are the trust's sole beneficiary, meaning that as of September 7th, the entire assemblage belongs to you. I studied the map, those 7 parcels wrapped around the rusty can in something close to a ring. Not seamless, there were breaks, but tight enough to command every practical route in or out for any distribution operation worth the name. She was building a freight corridor. I said she was protecting one. The rusty can, Adele said, sits precisely where 2 decommissioned rail spur lines cross 3 arterial streets. Control the surrounding parcels, and you control the most efficient last-mile distribution node in that whole quadrant of the south side. She let that land. Sylvia saw it long before the developers ever got close. The next 40 minutes she spent on the trust architecture. I told her early on that I wasn't a lawyer, and she absorbed this without any visible adjustment in her regard for me, simply shifting her vocabulary to match, and that small courtesy said more about her than any credential would have. The living trust she walked me through had been built to hold everything Sylvia had assembled on her own, apart from Miller's Express. Those assets carried the trust's name, not Sylvia's individual name, which meant Ohio probate had no claim on any of it. No delay, no judge, no filing with the county. On the morning Sylvia died, everything inside that trust passed to me. No friction, no intermediary as direct as one person handing something to another. Clifford cannot contest the trust, Adele said, and the precision she brought to it made clear she'd been waiting for exactly that question. The trust was built, capitalized, and legally structured, using only Sylvia's personal holdings assets that existed entirely apart from the Miller's Express corporate framework. There was no angle his lawyers could find. Sylvia had made sure of it. Clifford was on my mind. That penthouse morning. The word useless dropped with the offhand precision of a man who had written you out of his thinking long before he said it out loud. He doesn't know any of this exists. Not a question, a statement. No, Adele said. He does not. A second set of documents came out of the folder and landed on the table. 3 contracts each fronted by official county or state letterhead. Hamilton County Department of Health, Cincinnati Public Schools. Food Service Program, Ohio Department of Corrections Nutritional Services Division. Miller's Express carried active supply agreements with every one of them. Clifford had signed all 3, as CEO Adele told me, in the 18 months prior. She opened the first contract to the clause she wanted and smoothed it flat so my eyes could find it. Every contract carried a liquidated damages provision that fired the moment Miller's Express deviated materially from the FDA 21 CF Part 117 sanitation and quality standards written into the deal. Product that didn't measure up or the formulation changed without the contracting agency's prior. Written sign-off triggered fixed automatic liability. No litigation necessary. I worked through the clause a second time. How much, I asked. $8.2 million, she said. Across all 3 contracts combined payable by Miller's Express, within 90 days of a triggering event. She gave that a moment of air. Clifford had already begun swapping out ingredients in 2 of the 3 product lines. Reed's documentation established that. As of today, the clock was running. No satisfaction colored her voice. She delivered it the way a physician reads you your diagnosis. Not because the telling gives relief, but because you are owed the truth. She squared the 3 contracts into a stack and moved them off to one side. Then she crossed to the far end of the conference table, lifted a separate folder, thick its cover, a dark saturated red, and set it down between us. She left it closed. "Not today," she said. "Before we get to what Clifford planned to do with it, you need to sit with what you already hold." Her hand rested a moment on the red cover. "There will be a right moment for this. Today is not it." I looked at the folder. It seemed to hold my gaze in return. Reed guided me home through the early evening crawl, south along Columbia Parkway, the Ohio River, dark and wide beside the car. I watched the water and kept whatever I was thinking to myself. 7 parcels mapped across a city. A trust that had been repositioning assets without a sound for 5 years. A woman who had seen the whole shape of this from somewhere I hadn't yet located. Every road in this story still had miles left before I'd see where it ended. For the next 3 weeks, the red folder was the last thing I thought about each night. 3 days after sitting across from Adele Whitcomb, while she placed it on the table and told me the time wasn't right, I was still turning it over when I swung onto the Eisenhower Expressway and pointed the car west out of the city. I need to be honest about that. It had never left my head. It was with me lying awake in the warehouse that first night with me again when Reed brought me home along the river, and with me in the specific hush of a Cincinnati apartment that had stopped being mine without my consent, even though some part of me refused to concede that fact. The red folder was a door with no handle on my side, and Sylvia had always known that nothing undoes a man faster than the sight of a door he isn't allowed through yet. So I drove. "Go to Loveland," Adele had said, walking a key across her desk with the unhurried calm of someone handing off something that had been packed and ready for years. "You'll know the house when you see it." Sylvia had pressed that into me across 42 years. Sometimes the right move is to follow the instruction, get behind the wheel, and go. The Little Miami River appeared just shy of the town limits, the late September sun catching its surface in a way that belonged to another era entirely. Loveland was that kind of place somewhere that had quietly resolved at some point nobody could name to stay what it was. Chain stores could have the highway corridor. The town kept its old brick, its elm canopy, its farmer's market on 3rd Street every Saturday. I came to Riverview Drive without consulting the address. The house announced itself in red brick, 2 stories, a wide front porch, and 2 oak trees standing in the yard, with the settled authority of things planted by people long dead. Window boxes, a porch swing. It was the kind of house that doesn't make an entrance. It simply exists, steady and unhurried, the way a house gets when it has been cared for by someone invested in the structure itself, rather than in what the block might fetch on a good weekend. I sat behind the wheel a moment before I moved. Then Adele's key opened the front door, and I stepped inside. The place was clean still and furnished throughout, not the hollow tidiness of a staged property, but the fuller, more considered quality of rooms, where every object had been placed on purpose. The kitchen shelves were not bare. The refrigerator was stocked with basics and fresh vegetables, and on the top shelf sat a quart of chicken stock in a container. I placed immediately a particular specialty grocer on 3rd Street, its name confirmed by a receipt tucked beneath a magnet on the refrigerator door. The receipt was dated September 14th, 3 days earlier. Somebody had stood in this kitchen and filled that refrigerator 3 days ago. On the counter, propped open to the first page, was a spiral-bound notebook covered in Sylvia's handwriting. A directory of sorts, the doctor's practice 2 blocks away, the hardware store, the dry cleaner, the farmer's market hours, and the name of the head librarian whom Sylvia apparently knew well enough to flag as worth seeking out on the subject of Cincinnati history if you get restless. Lower, on the page in ink that was slightly different, added at a later sitting, "The freezer has the lamb stew. You always liked it better the second day." Standing in Sylvia's kitchen in a house I had walked into for the first time, I felt something in my chest, release that had been locked down for 3 weeks, something close to the ability to breathe all the way in. The knock came 40 minutes after that, while I was still at the counter with the notebook open in my hands. The woman at the door was somewhere around 70, white hair, cropped close with the grounded, unshockable bearing of someone who has spent enough decades in a small town to have seen the range of human behavior and stopped marveling at it. She had a pot gripped in both hands, the large no-nonsense kind that signals serious intention. "You must be Eugene," she said. "I'm Bet Morrow. I live next door." She raised the pot a fraction. "Chicken soup. Sylvia told me you'd arrive sometime around the end of September. She figured you'd probably miss lunch." I looked at the pot. I looked at Bet. "She told you I was coming. She left me a note with your photograph," Bet said, as if this required no more explanation than a weather report. "And her phone number, though I never had cause to use it. She rang me herself every few months just to see how things stood." She paused. "Are you going to let me in, or would you rather I set this down on the porch?" We took our places at the kitchen table with the soup going on the stove, and Bet walked me through the visits. Sylvia had made the trip to Loveland 4 times across the past 2 years, always on her own, always slipping in on a weekday when the street held nothing but its own quiet. She'd carried a measuring tape and a legal pad, and she'd worked her way through every room writing as she went. When she introduced herself to Bet on that first occasion, she came straight to the point. "I'm Sylvia Varden. I own the house next door, and I want to know you because my husband will need a neighbor here when he arrives." I asked her once what she was building. Bet said, both palms wrapped around her coffee mug. She considered me as though the question were plainly the right one and answered, "A soft landing. No performance in it. Just the words." That was what I kept noticing about everyone Sylvia had brought into this. They all held her instructions in the same way she had handed them over, directly without gilding, as if the gravity of the situation could carry itself, and didn't require their help to be felt. I finished 2 bowls of soup. I hadn't registered the hunger until the first mouthful told me the truth, and then it was clear I had gone without a real meal for the better part of 3 weeks. When Bet left, I settled onto the porch swing and watched the last light drain off the river while the lamps along Riverview Drive blinked on down the block one after another. The town held the kind of quiet that is earned rather than empty, settled, not abandoned. I pictured Sylvia moving through these rooms with her tape and her legal pad, 2 years ago measuring, noting, planning. I thought about all the outings she had named as nothing, a quick errand, a short drive, an afternoon to herself. And I thought about 42 years of mornings and the questions I had never thought to ask on any of them. She had been saying goodbye to me for 2 years before I understood that was what she was doing. Sleep didn't come easily in those first weeks in Loveland. The house was comfortable, more comfortable than I had any claim to, having shown up with a single bag and clothes I'd been living in for the better part of 3 days. Sylvia had arranged for that the same way she had arranged for everything else. But comfort and sleep aren't the same currency. At 3 in the morning, when the town had gone completely still, I lay on top of the covers, listening to the Little Miami River move through the dark beyond the garden, and I turned over all the things I hadn't had room to think about while I was still in Cincinnati. Most of those thoughts had Clifford's name somewhere in them. The box of photographs was sitting on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, exactly where Sylvia would have placed something she intended me to find eventually, but not right away high enough to require a moment's awareness, low enough to reach without a ladder. A shoebox taped shut my name on the lid in blue marker. I carried it downstairs on a Tuesday morning when the light off the river held that specific silver-gray quality that belongs to early October. I sat at the kitchen table and lifted the lid. 60 photographs, give or take, arranged without any regard for sequence. Sylvia had never ordered photographs by date, which had quietly annoyed me for years and which I now recognized as intentional. She sorted them by feeling rather than chronology. The one resting on top was Clifford at 8 years old. I hadn't asked her to lead with that one. She had understood to anyway. He was standing on a step stool in the kitchen of the restaurant, the original location on South Halsted, before we expanded. The apron draped over him was an adult medium, its hem landing somewhere around his knees, the chest panel swallowing most of his torso. He held a chef's knife in both hands and was looking directly at me with the particular focused intensity of a child who is determined to get something right. "Dad," he'd said, "am I holding it right?" I remembered what his hands felt like when I put mine over them. Still small at 8, the kind of small you don't think to memorize until the day it's gone and you're trying to place exactly when it disappeared. I had corrected his grip 2 fingers on the blade spine, the pinch of thumb and forefinger at the bolster. Like that, I'd said. Always like that, and you'll never lose control of it. Sylvia had been standing in the kitchen doorway. I hadn't heard her come in. She moved quietly when she chose to, which was almost always. She was smiling the way she smiled when she didn't want to be caught caring. Just the corner of her mouth, her gaze aimed slightly off to one side. Clifford had spent the next 20 minutes practicing the grip without cutting a thing. He simply stood on that step stool, taking the knife back to the correct hold again and again, getting the feel into his hands. He was a serious child. He wanted to understand things from the inside out, not just the surface. I set the photograph on the table and looked at it for a long time. I know the year things changed. I've known it for a decade, and that knowledge has never made it any easier to carry. Clifford was 22. He had just finished his MBA program at Wharton, which he had mentioned 3 times over the graduation dinner, and I had been proud, genuinely proud, in the uncomplicated way that exists. Before you learn that your pride can become a thing your child wields. He'd taken a position at a mid-sized private equity firm in the Carew Tower district and came home for Sunday dinner the following month. Somewhere between the salad course and the main, he had looked around the restaurant. My restaurant, the one Sylvia and I had raised from one rented kitchen on Freeman Avenue, and 40 years of 6-day weeks, and said with the particular gentleness that cuts deeper than cruelty, "It's a sweet little operation, a nice hobby for you both." Sylvia said nothing. She set her fork down, picked it back up, and let her gaze settle on the middle distance for a moment. That particular stillness she moved into when she was deciding whether something was worth answering. She decided it wasn't. I said nothing either. I have wished ever since that I had. Every year since that wish comes back. That was 2012, the year the language shifted from we and us to you and your thing. I told myself it was just a young man trying on a new vocabulary, one he hadn't yet learned the price of. I told myself that for 11 years. The phone rang at 2 Lure on a Wednesday afternoon while I was on the back porch watching the river run. The name on the screen was one I hadn't encountered since the morning he'd stood in the penthouse living room and informed me the apartment was his now, and I needed to be gone by evening. Clifford. I watched his name sit there on the screen. I thought about the step stool and the chef's knife and the particular weight of small hands under mine. I thought about the word hobby delivered across a dinner table with a law school smile. I thought about the penthouse morning and the suitcase packed in 20 minutes, and the drive to West End with no clear destination. The phone rang 7 times, and then it didn't. I set it face down on the porch railing and turned back to the river. "Where did you go, son?" I thought, not with anger, which would have been a simpler thing to carry, but with the heavy, worn-down grief of a man who has been asking the same question for 11 years without getting any closer to an answer. "Where did you go, and what did we do wrong that made you into someone who could do this?" The river moved. The afternoon light changed its angle. I left the phone where it was. Adele had told me to follow the trade papers. She'd said it near the end of our meeting, almost as a footnote, or what presented as a footnote, though I'd come to understand by then that nothing Adele said was accidental. Follow the new news, she'd told me. Sylvia said you'll know when it starts. So each morning I sat at the kitchen table in Loveland with coffee and the digital edition of the Cincinnati Food Industry Weekly, reading my way through distribution contracts and supplier negotiations and the slow institutional machinery of an industry I'd spent 40 years inside without ever quite learning its dialect. The river outside had gone gray by then. October gray, the shade a sky turns when it has committed to winter, and I read with the close attention of a man who doesn't know exactly what he's waiting for but has been reliably informed that it's on its way. It arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of October. The headline was on page 3 of the trade section. Miller's Express announces bold reformulation strategy. Modern efficiency meets legacy flavor. I read it twice, then a third time the way you go back over something when your mind won't absorb it in a single pass. Clifford had convened a supplier briefing the previous Thursday. The article quoted him directly, confident corporate, the cadence of a man who has persuaded himself that efficiency and wisdom are the same thing. He announced that Miller's Express would be modernizing its core product formulations across all three government contract lines, moving to what he called contemporary ingredient profiles that would cut production costs by an estimated 31%, while preserving the essential character of the original recipes. The phrase essential character settled in my chest like something heavy and cold. Those formulas were Sylvia's. 40 years of iteration and refinement built from the flavor profiles she and I had first worked out in that rented kitchen on Freeman Avenue, tested batch by batch, adjusted season by season. They were not ingredient lists. They were the accumulated judgment of two people who had devoted their lives to understanding what food should taste like when it is made with genuine care. You couldn't swap in contemporary ingredient profiles and preserve anything essential. You could only replace what was there. I called Phil before 8 so in the morning. Phyllis Taggart. Phil, to everyone who actually knew her, had been Sylvia's operations manager at Miller's Express for 19 years. She was in her mid-50s, methodical, carrying the institutional memory of someone who had touched every purchase order and supplier contract the company had generated since 2004. Sylvia had trusted her with things she hadn't trusted to anyone else, myself included. I had understood for years that this wasn't a slight. It was a practical decision. Phil knew where every document lived and precisely what it meant. Sylvia had made certain of that deliberately. 2 years ago, Sylvia had brought Phil into something larger. When Sylvia first overheard Clifford and Kurt Brennan laying out their plans on a conference call she wasn't supposed to be on, she'd gone to Phil the following morning. Together, quietly, they had begun assembling a record, emails, meeting minutes, supplier correspondence, wire transfer documentation. Phil had filed a formal whistleblower disclosure with the FBI under the False Claims Act 14 months earlier, coordinated through Adele's office. She picked up on the second ring. "I saw it," she said before I got a word out. "Tell me what you know," she said. Clifford had signed a supply agreement with a manufacturer called Brennan Ingredient Solutions, Kurt Brennan's company, 6 weeks prior. The deal replaced 4 of the 5 core ingredient sources written into the government contracts. These were not minor adjustments. 2 of the substitute compounds had never been evaluated against the FDA 21 CFR Part 117 sanitation and quality standards embedded in the Hamilton County and Cincinnati Public Schools contracts. A third substitution, a thickening agent, was flatly prohibited under the Ohio DOC Nutritional Services Agreement. He signed it himself, Phil said. Kurt drafted it. Clifford never sent it to outside counsel for review. I turned that over against the clause Adele had shown me in her office. Material deviation from specified formulations, without prior written approval from the contracting agency. Sylvia had fought to get that language in. I could remember now that Clifford had pushed back on it when he stepped in as CEO, called it unnecessarily restrictive at a board meeting I attended as a courtesy. Sylvia hadn't argued. She had simply made certain the clause stayed. Adele called at 11:15. No pleasantries. The auditors confirmed this morning 7 violations across the 3 contract lines. The contracting agencies were notified as of 9:00 a.m. A pause. The liquidated damages clause has been activated. Miller's Express has 90 days to pay $8.2 million, or the debt moves to collections with the county and state attorneys. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the river. Clifford signed those contracts himself. Adele said every word of that penalty clause is Sylvia's language written into the agreements in 2018 while she was still running the company. She told me at the time she hoped it would never be needed. Another pause, and then more quietly, she also told me she suspected it would be. Does he know? Yet I asked. His attorney received formal notice this morning. He knows. I had expected to feel something different. Relief, maybe, or the satisfaction of a wrong finally being corrected, the clean sense of resolution that justice is supposed to carry when it arrives. Those things didn't come. What settled in instead was a tiredness and a sadness that sat differently from grief. Not the sadness of losing something, but the sadness of having something confirmed. The sadness of carrying a hope in that quieter part of yourself that doesn't know any better that you'd been wrong about how things were going to go. I thought about Clifford at 22, sitting across a restaurant table and calling 40 years of work a hobby. I thought about him at 33, putting his name to contracts he hadn't read carefully, trusting a man who was using him just as much as he was being used in return. I thought about the step stool and the chef's knife, and the small hands I'd covered with mine in that kitchen on South Halsted a long time ago. This was not a victory. It was what it looks like when a father watches his son walk into a room that has been locked from the outside for 20 years and understands that the son never knew the door was already shut when he chose to go through it. Clifford found me after 14 days. Adele had warned me he would. She'd said it, as she said most things plainly without cushioning when we spoke, after the liquidated damages notice went out. "He'll find you," she'd said. "Men like Clifford don't hold still when the ground shifts under them." What she hadn't told me was that he'd bring a lawyer. I was at the kitchen table when the car appeared, a black sedan Cincinnati plates, parked in front of the house with a precision that didn't belong to someone who'd arrived by chance. I watched through the window. Clifford stepped out first. He had on a coat I didn't recognize, the kind that costs more than it should, and he moved across the yard with the clipped efficiency of a man who has decided that forward motion and control are the same thing. The second man followed, a mid-40s leather portfolio under his arm, the carefully neutral expression of someone whose job requires him to have no visible feelings about anything. I opened the door before they made it to the porch. "How did you find me?" I asked. Clifford's jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't difficult. "I hired someone." He said it without apology, as though locating his father through a private investigator was an unremarkable administrative matter, which meant 2 weeks of searching, which meant the 14 days of silence hadn't been indifference, they'd been preparation. I stepped back and let them in. There was nothing to be gained from conducting this conversation on the front porch, where Bet Morrow might hear it through her kitchen window. They sat at the table where I'd eaten my first real meal in Loveland 6 weeks earlier. Clifford looked around the kitchen with the appraising, slightly baffled expression of a man encountering something he hadn't known existed and couldn't quite categorize. I didn't offer coffee. I sat across from them and waited. The lawyer, whose name was Creel, from a firm in the Carew Tower district, opened his portfolio and set 2 documents on the table. He was measured and clear and delivered everything without apparent ill will, which somehow made it worse. Miller's Express, he explained, was facing an $8.2 million liquidated damages claim across 3 government contracts. That claim was a corporate liability, a debt of the company, not of Clifford Varden as an individual. Under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code, Miller's Express could file for reorganization. Upon filing, an automatic stay would take effect, immediately freezing all collection actions against the company, including the LD claims from Hamilton County Cincinnati Public Schools and the Ohio Department of Corrections. The stay would pause enforcement for a minimum of 6 to 8 months, Creel said in the same tone a contractor uses when explaining load-bearing walls. During that window, the company reorganizes its debt structure and presents a plan to its creditors. The government agencies become unsecured creditors. Their claims are restructured, not eliminated, but the immediate financial pressure is removed. He placed a 3rd document on the table. Additionally, he said, under Chapter 11, the company's assets fall under protection of the bankruptcy estate. Any attempt to reach Miller's Express assets during the stay period requires court approval to proceed. Clifford had said nothing yet. He was watching me. I looked at the documents. I looked at Creel. I looked at Clifford. "The personal guarantee question," I said. Creel paused fractionally, just enough to signal that I'd gone there directly. Mr. Varden did not sign personal guarantees on the government supply contracts. The liability is corporate. The room went quiet, except for the river outside, which had slowed to its winter pace. Heavier, more deliberate, the way water moves when cold is close. I'm not a lawyer. I've said that before, and I mean it without embarrassment. There are things that require 20 years of study before they come into focus, and corporate bankruptcy law is one of them. But I have spent 40 years building something, which means I have spent 40 years learning to recognize the moment when a structure you trusted turns out to be carrying a load it was never designed for. Sylvia had built the liquidated damages clause to deliver immediate, unavoidable financial consequence. Automatic, no court required, as she'd told Adele. She had believed the speed and certainty of the penalty would leave Clifford with nowhere to maneuver. What she had not, as far as I could see, designed against was Chapter 11. It was a gap, real, legal, exploitable, the kind that exists. Not because Sylvia wasn't thorough. She was the most thorough person I had ever known, but perhaps because she had imagined a version of her son who would not be willing to take the company she had built and turn its own bankruptcy into a weapon against her. I looked at Clifford. He was still watching me, and for a moment, just a moment, something showed beneath the polished surface of the man sitting across the table. Something that looked less like strategy and more like a man running out of room. "You should go," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I'll call you tomorrow." Clifford started to speak. I raised one hand, and whatever he saw in my face made the argument seem less worth pursuing because he stopped. He and Creel gathered their documents and left the way they'd come, the black sedan pulling away from the curb with the same studied precision it had arrived with. I called Adele at 4. I told her everything Creel had laid out in order, and when I finished, there was a silence on the line I hadn't encountered from her before. Adele Whitcomb was not a woman given to pauses. She moved at speed and responded with precision, and I had come to rely on that the way you rely on a compass you've learned to trust. This silence was something else. "Did Sylvia consider a Chapter 11 scenario?" I asked. The pause stretched another few seconds before she answered. "No." She said it carefully, the way you say something you've just finished confirming to yourself. That's not something she accounted for. She believed Adele stopped and started again. What I was about to learn would change how I understood everything that had come before it. Not just what had been done, but how long it had been in motion, and by whose hand. "I want to ask you something before we go further. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you gather every piece of evidence first and let the truth speak for itself?" She believed Clifford would fight the penalty. She did not believe he would sacrifice the company to escape it. I sat with that. Sylvia had built something extraordinary. She had thought further ahead than I could have imagined any one person thinking had laid her groundwork across years and decades, with a patience and precision I was still only beginning to fully comprehend. She had accounted for Clifford's ambition and his carelessness, and his willingness to cut corners and his relationship with Kurt Brennan. She had built her plan for a version of Clifford that was slightly less willing, slightly less cornered, perhaps, than the man who had just sat across my kitchen table with a portfolio and a lawyer and the particular expression of someone who has already made up his mind. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers and listened to the Little Miami River and turned over what Adele had said. The thing she hadn't accounted for the way you turn over. A stone found somewhere. Stones have no business being looking for what's underneath. The automatic stay. 6 to 8 months of frozen enforcement. Clifford's lawyer sitting at my kitchen table with the calm, professional expression of a man delivering a forecast, not a threat. Sylvia had been thorough beyond anything I could have engineered myself. She had spent years on this, and she had missed something. I didn't know what to do with that. I lay there until 4 in the morning, then got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. I thought about a woman who had measured every room in this house with a tape measure and written down the names of the local doctors, and still had not seen one thing coming. At 7:45, Adele called. "I want to tell you something I should have told you last week," she said, before the meeting with Clifford's attorney. I didn't because I needed you to hear the Chapter 11 argument without knowing what I'm about to tell you." She needed to see whether it changed my reaction. I said nothing. I waited. Sylvia did not build only one trap, Adele said. Then she told me about the phone call. 2 years ago, October 2021, Sylvia had been working late in her office at Miller's Express when a conference line she'd been inadvertently left on connected her to a conversation between Clifford and Kurt Brennan. 22 minutes. She had sat completely still and listened to every word of it. When the call ended, she had written down everything she could reconstruct from memory in the small, precise handwriting I knew from 40 years of grocery lists and recipe notes. The following morning, she had called Phil Taggart into her office and shut the door. What Phyllis Taggart had assembled over the next 14 months was not incidental. It was systematic, the kind of evidence gathering that demands patience and access, and the ability to appear entirely unremarkable while doing something that is anything but. Emails between Clifford and Brennan, some routed through a third-party server to skirt the company's internal system, which Phil had flagged and preserved. meeting minutes that had been altered between their first and second drafts, both versions retained. Wire transfer records from a Miller's Express subsidiary account showing a series of payments to a Brennan-affiliated LLC, with no corresponding vendor relationship anywhere in the company's books. In March 2022, Sylvia had walked into Adele's office with a folder and said, "I want to file a qui tam complaint under the False Claims Act. I want Phil protected under the False Claims Act's anti-retaliation provision, 31 U.S.C. Section 3730. H before we do anything else. It covers private sector employees who report fraud against the government. No one can touch her job, her records, or her testimony. And I want the FBI to have everything before I'm gone." She was already sick when she filed. Adele said she'd known for 4 months. She hadn't told me the diagnosis until after they submitted. I set down my coffee cup. "The Chapter 11 filing," I said. "The automatic stay. Does that cover—" "No." Adele's voice was immediate and precise. "A Chapter 11 bankruptcy stay applies to civil claims, the liquidated damages collection, the government contract terminations. It does not touch a federal criminal investigation. The FBI case proceeds completely independently of whatever Clifford does with the company in bankruptcy court. The wire transfers, the fraudulent, accounting the False Claims Act violations, those don't freeze. They continue." She let that land for a moment. Sylvia understood the difference, she said. She built the liquidated damages layer to create immediate financial pressure. She built the FBI layer to create permanent consequence. One can be delayed, the other cannot. I sat with that for a long while after we hung up. Sylvia had not missed anything. She had built 2 structures, one financial, one criminal, knowing that a man clever enough to slip out of the first would walk directly into the second. The Chapter 11 filing, if Clifford chose it, would cost him, the company, and 18 months of his life navigating bankruptcy court. The FBI investigation, when it concluded, would cost him considerably more. She had seen it coming. She had simply not laid it all out for me at once, and I was only now understanding why, because the plan only works if the person it's protecting doesn't know enough to accidentally disclose it. She had trusted me with exactly as much as I needed to hold. Claudia Fenby called at 2 in the afternoon. She introduced herself as the VP of Development at Meridian Food Network, a mid-sized cable and streaming operation based in Cincinnati that I'd heard of only peripherally, but couldn't have described in any detail. She had a direct, warm manner that brought to mind the food journalists Sylvia had always liked, the ones who ate first and took notes after. Sylvia had reached out to her 22 months ago, January 2022. She had sent Claudia 47 videos, cooking videos me in various kitchens over various years, narrating technique and memory, and the particular logic of flavor I had spent a career developing. Sylvia had filmed some of them herself over the years without telling me she was keeping them. Others were older recordings from catering events and cooking demonstrations that Sylvia had quietly preserved and digitized. Claudia had watched all 47 within 2 weeks of receiving them. She had called Sylvia immediately and told her the material was extraordinary, that the combination of technical depth and personal narrative was precisely what her network had been trying to find for 2 years. Sylvia had said, "Don't call him yet. Wait until he's stopped falling." She was very specific, Claudia said. She said to wait for a signal that he was stable. She said he'd need time before he could hear any of this. A pause. "I waited 3 months after she passed. I called your attorney's office last week to confirm you were ready. She told me you were." I didn't say anything for a moment. Don't call him while he's still falling. Sylvia had been filing federal whistleblower cases and building television development deals at the same time. She had been doing this while she was sick, while she was dying, while she was measuring rooms in a house in Loveland and writing down the name of the local librarian and laying out my vest for her own funeral. Sylvia Varden had never done only one thing at a time. Not in 42 years. I don't know why. I thought death would change that. I drove up to Cincinnati on a Wednesday morning in the middle of December for the first time since September. The expressway was gray and familiar, the skyline assembling itself out of the distance, the way it always had, the same sequence of buildings, the same angle of approach. The Ohio River appearing off to the side like a reminder of scale. The city looked exactly as it had. I did not. Claudia's office was in a converted building in Over the Rhine, the old meatpacking district, that had spent the better part of a decade becoming something else entirely. All exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling glass, and the particular creative energy of a neighborhood that has decided its industrial past is an aesthetic rather than a history. Her space had the controlled warmth of someone who understood how environments shape decisions. Plants on the windowsill, good coffee. 2 screens on the far wall, already cued. She stood when I walked in, shook my hand, and said, "I'm glad you came. I know this wasn't a small thing to do." It wasn't, but I was done waiting for things to feel small before I did them. She dimmed the room slightly and started the first video. The kitchen I saw on the screen was my own, the one on Lynn Street, the original restaurant kitchen before the Norwood expansion. I recognized the particular way the morning light came through the east-facing window at that hour, the way it always caught the copper pots, at an angle that made them look like something out of a painting. I was standing at the center island working a reduction, and as far as the camera could tell, I was entirely alone. Sylvia had been in the doorway. I hadn't known. The camera was steady. She'd braced it against the doorframe, I realized, which was why there was no shake, and from somewhere behind the lens, barely audible, her voice. That's it, just like that. She wasn't talking to me. I was 30 FT away and couldn't hear her. She was talking to herself, or to the recording, or to whoever she imagined might watch it one day. Claudia played the second clip, then the third. In each one, I was cooking different kitchens, different years, different light, the restaurant, our home kitchen in Indian Hill, the back prep room at Miller's Express on a morning when I'd apparently come in early, and Sylvia had apparently come in earlier still. Each time the same arrangement, Sylvia in a doorway or behind a counter, or just at the edge of the frame holding the shot level. And each time that voice just below the threshold of hearing. There it is. Just like that. By the 7th video, I had stopped watching the screen. I was watching Sylvia. There's a memory I've held for years that I've never found the right words to describe. Sunday mornings in Indian Hill during the years when Clifford was in high school, the house loud through the week and quiet on weekends in a way that felt like something you'd worked for. I'd be at the stove by 7 working through whatever had come to me that morning. Nothing planned, just the particular pleasure of time with no obligations and good ingredients. Sylvia would be at the kitchen table with her coffee, not reading, not on her phone, simply present, in the way she had of inhabiting a moment completely. I asked her once why she didn't read on those mornings the way she read every other morning of her life. She looked up from her cup. "Because you're the only person I know who looks completely at peace when you're working," she said. "And I like watching that. I don't want to miss it." I hadn't known what to do with that then. I do now. The 47 videos were 47 Sunday mornings she had kept. Not because she imagined I'd be famous someday, not because she was assembling a television program, though she was, but because she had wanted to hold on to the thing she loved about watching me, and she had done it the way she did everything quietly, carefully, without ceremony, because it mattered to her. Claudia paused the screen after the 12th video and looked across at me. "Are you ready to keep going today?" "No," I said, "not today." She nodded. We talked for an hour about the production concept. 24 episodes technique and memory, the kind of cooking that carries a whole life inside it. She was precise and considered, and I could hear in how she spoke about food that she understood what it actually was. Not content, not entertainment, the daily labor of keeping something alive. We agreed to nothing formal. We shook hands. She said the project would wait as long as it needed to. I drove south out of the city in the early afternoon and left the radio off. I got back to Loveland as the last of the light was leaving the river. I hung up my coat, opened the refrigerator, and stood there a moment, taking stock of what was inside. And then I did something I hadn't done in 3 months. I started cooking. Not from a recipe. I hadn't needed recipes in 40 years. From memory, from instinct, from the particular knowledge that settles into your hands. When you've done something long enough, that the intelligence migrates down from your mind. Saffron steeped in warm stock. Arborio rice toasted dry in the pan. White wine reduced. The slow work of adding stock. Ladle by ladle, each addition drawn in before the next, the patient construction of something that cannot be hurried, without being destroyed. The window above the sink was cracked open against the heat coming off the stove. The cold December air filtered through in thin threads. 20 minutes in there was a knock at the back door. Bet in her coat, wearing the look of someone who has caught a scent worth crossing next door for in 15-degree weather. "Is that Saffron?" she said. "Come in," I said. We ate at the kitchen table, the two of us, and Bet talked about her late husband while I told her about the first time Sylvia had made this dish. We finished off the last of a bottle of white wine that had been sitting in the refrigerator for 3 weeks. It was a quiet evening, ordinary in the way that only evenings spent with good people in warm kitchens can be ordinary, which is to say, not ordinary at all. When Bet left, I cleared the dishes, and then before sitting down, I pulled a third chair away from the wall and set it at the table. I hadn't decided to do it. My hands did it, and my mind came along behind, the way it had been happening a lot lately. I looked at the empty chair for a moment. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. 47 mornings Sylvia had filmed without my knowing. 47 times she had steadied the camera in a doorway and watched me work and said beneath her breath, to no one and to everyone, "That's it, just like that." In every single frame she was smiling. 4 months. That was how long I had been carrying the image of that red folder, its particular weight, on Adele's conference table. Her hand resting briefly on the cover, the way she had said, "Not today," with the quiet certainty of someone who knows precisely when today will become the right day. I had thought about it in Loveland in October, lying awake, listening to the river. I had thought about it through November when Clifford came with his lawyer and the Chapter 11 argument. I had thought about it through December, through Claudia's office and the 47 videos, and the saffron risotto and the empty chair, when Adele called in the first week of January and said, "Come in, Eugene, it's time." I was already putting on my coat. The conference room looked the same as it had in September. The Ohio River in the distance the same winter gray as the first visit. Adele was at the table, and beside her sat a man I hadn't met 60 or so, with the bearing of someone who has spent a career examining financial records that other people hoped would never see daylight. He had that particular unhurried precision that belongs to people who understand that numbers do not lie, but that the stories constructed around them very often do. "Eugene, this is Arden Spruill," Adele said. "He's a forensic accountant. Sylvia retained him independently in March 2022, the same month she filed the whistleblower complaint." Arden shook my hand and laid a bound report on the table between us. He was not a man who spent time on preamble. "I'll walk you through what we found," he said, "and then I'll answer whatever questions you have." He opened the report to the first tabbed section. The red folder contained 3 categories of information. Arden took them in order. The first was the phone call. Adele had told me in November that Sylvia had overheard Clifford and Kurt Brennan on a conference line in October 2021, but she hadn't told me what was said. Arden had the reconstructed transcript assembled from Sylvia's handwritten notes, and subsequently confirmed by documents Phil had gathered. Clifford and Kurt had been discussing the acquisition not as a future possibility, but as a plan with a timeline. Kurt's offer was structured as a private sale. Miller's Food Empire, the holding company sitting above Miller's Express and its associated IP assets, valued at 32% below its own independently appraised worth. Below the figure Sylvia's own advisors had documented below what any arm's-length transaction would have produced. The discount wasn't a negotiating position. It was the price of keeping things quiet and moving fast before any other buyers could be brought in. Kurt would acquire the company. The Miller brand would be folded into his distribution network and rebranded within 18 months. The name would be retired. 40 years of work dissolved into a holding company in Wilmington, Delaware, and gone. Clifford stood to receive a personal payment outside the sales structure, Arden said, turning to the second section. We identified 14 transactions between a Miller's Express subsidiary account and an LLC registered in Delaware Stfield Capital Partners. The LLC has no employees, no operating history, and no business purpose we can identify. The total transferred was $2.3 million, distributed across 14 months in amounts calculated to stay below federal reporting thresholds. He said it without inflection. Facts placed in sequence. I had learned in the months since September that the most devastating information comes through most clearly when no one editorializes it. "That's a bribe," I said. "It's an undisclosed payment to a CEO in connection with a pending transaction involving company assets." Arden said, "Which constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty under Ohio corporate law and likely wire fraud under federal statute. The FBI has this documentation." The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at the report on the table. Then I looked at Adele. Sylvia knew all of this, I said. From October 2021. She knew the broad shape of it from their phone call. Arden's work filled in the financial particulars over the year that followed. She knew what Clifford was before the end came. Adele hadn't looked away from any of it. Yes, I sat with that. The river outside the gray January light. My son 40 months ago on a conference line with Kurt Brennan, working out the price at which he'd hand over his mother's life's work while she was still at the helm, still breathing. Did she believe he was doing it for the money, I asked? Or did she think he'd actually persuaded himself it was the right call? Adele gave the question the weight it deserved, which I was grateful for. She didn't rush to answer. Both, she said at last. She believed it was both, that Clifford had talked himself into the sale as a sound business decision, and that the conviction came considerably easier, given that he was pocketing $2.3 million to hold it. She paused. Sylvia understood that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. She felt Clifford had grown fluent in that particular language. I thought about Clifford at 22, sitting at the dinner table and dismissing 40 years of work as a hobby. I thought about the distance between an 8-year-old on a step stool, learning to hold a knife correctly, and a man on a phone call 40 months ago selling the knife the kitchen and everything inside it. I had no clean answer for that. I wasn't sure one existed. She built all of this to punish him. I said it not quite a question. No, Adele said it without a beat of hesitation. She'd put that question to her directly in this office in the spring of 2022, when Adele was already sick and they were going over the full plan. She said, I'm not building this to punish Clifford. I'm building it to stop him and to give him a reason to become someone else. She believed there was still a version of him capable of different choices if the price of the wrong ones was made plain enough. Adele folded her hands on the table. She was a more patient person than I am. I drove back to Loveland late that afternoon, south on the expressway, with the city falling away behind me. I kept thinking about a woman who had spent her final 2 years gathering evidence against her own son, while at the same time assembling a television show for her husband, arranging a quiet place for him in a river town, and building a legal structure that would look after me for the rest of my days. Before I'd left, Arden had said 3 weeks. He hadn't said what was happening in 3 weeks. He and Adele had exchanged a look. I recognized the look of people who know precisely what they're waiting for and have concluded, I don't need to know it yet. I drove home to Loveland and counted the days. I didn't know what I was counting toward, but I'd worked enough kitchens over enough years to know the feeling, something that has been slow cooking in the dark for a long time and is nearly done. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in the first week of February. I was at the kitchen counter measuring out coffee when my phone rang. Adele before 7 in the morning, something she had never done before. Turn on the television, Eugene. I turned it on. The crawl along the bottom of the screen read, FBI announces investigation into Brennan's ingredient solutions. CEO Kurt Brennan named in food fraud and corporate conspiracy charges. The anchor was reading from a prepared statement. Behind him, file footage of a Cincinnati commercial building I didn't recognize. Then briefly, a photograph of Kurt Brennan with the particular quality of an image pulled from a company website, the kind a man has taken when he still believes he controls how he's seen. I watched for 3 minutes. Then I switched off the television and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the Little Miami River through the window. The water was the color of slate. A thin shelf of ice had formed along the near bank overnight. How long have you known this was coming? I asked. 3 weeks, Adele said. Arden had been notified by the FBI contact when the arrest warrant was issued. They'd waited for the public announcement. A pause. Sylvia wanted you to hear it the way everyone else would on the news in the morning at home. Of course she did. Alvin Good arrived at the Loveland house at 10:15. He was a quiet man, 70s, a retired notary and a state document custodian, who had worked within Sylvia's attorney network for 20 years. He carried himself the way a person does who has spent a long career handling things that matter deeply to others, and has learned to bear that weight without being broken by it. Sylvia had given him one sealed envelope 18 months ago with a single instruction. Deliver this on the day the FBI goes public. Not before? He placed the envelope in my hands, shook my hand, and left without staying for coffee. He seemed to understand that the moment didn't call for company. I opened it at the kitchen table. Sylvia's handwriting. Half a page. The letters slightly uneven toward the end. The way they got later in the illness, I could tell now when the medication had touched her. Fine motor control, though. Never her clarity. I built the trap, Eugene. I set every piece of it, and I watched it for 2 years, and I believe it will hold. But I couldn't write the ending. That part was never mine to write. It belongs to you. It always has. Whatever you decide to do with what remains, do it as yourself. Not as the man who was angry, and not as the man who was afraid. As the man who stood in a kitchen for 40 years and understood that the most important thing about a meal is who you choose to share it with. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I sat with the letter for a long time. The river moved outside. The house was quiet in the way it had become, not empty exactly, but shaped around an absence. Adele called again at 11:40. Clifford filed Chapter 11 this morning, 90 minutes after the FBI announcement went public. Her voice was carefully neutral. His attorneys filed on an emergency basis. They're arguing the liquidated damages claims and any civil actions tied to the government contracts should be stayed pending reorganization. A pause. He's trying to use the bankruptcy to slow down the civil exposure while he takes stock of his criminal liability. Will it work for the civil claims? Possibly for a time. For the FBI investigation, Chapter 11 doesn't touch the criminal case. Another pause longer. This is outside what Sylvia planned for Eugene. She accounted for a Chapter 11 filing in the abstract. As you know, she didn't account for Clifford filing on the same morning as the FBI announcement as a direct response to it. Adele's voice held steady, but I caught something underneath it I hadn't heard from her before. Not uncertainty, something different. What would you like to do? I looked at Sylvia's letter, still open on the table in front of me. That part was never mine to write. Give me an hour, I said. I didn't call Adele back. I called Clifford. He picked up on the first ring, which told me everything about what the past 3 hours had been like for him. Dad! His voice was flat, stripped of the polish I'd been hearing for 11 years. The MBA cadence, the Carew Tower District register. The particular tone of a man who has rehearsed confidence so completely, he's forgotten what he sounded like before it. What I heard instead was something younger and far less certain. I know what you filed this morning, I said. I know why, and I know it won't do what you're hoping it will. Silence. Clifford. I kept my voice even not cold. I'd had months to move well past cold, and cold wasn't what the moment called for. The FBI has had an arrest warrant ready for Kurt Brennan for 3 weeks. Your bankruptcy filing doesn't touch their case against you. What it does is make you look like a man who ran the moment the door came open. I paused. I'm going to offer you something once. I won't offer it again. I told him what I was proposing. Withdraw the Chapter 11 filing. Cooperate with the FBI, fully documentation, no reservations, nothing held back. Hand them Kurt Brennan and the 14 transactions and everything else in the Delaware account records. In exchange, I would not pursue the civil breach of fiduciary duty claims against him personally. And I would write a letter to the federal prosecutor documenting his cooperation and asking that his individual sentencing, if it came to that, reflect the assistance he'd provided. I couldn't promise him an outcome that wasn't mine to give. But I could promise him that a man who handed over everything and stood up and said, I did this, and here is all of it, was standing in a different place than a man who filed emergency bankruptcy motions on the morning of an FBI announcement. Why would you do this? Clifford asked. I paused before answering, not because I lacked the answer, but because I needed to find the form that was honest, without becoming theatrical. Because your mother asked me to, I said, and because I'd rather you walked away from this with something worth building toward than spent whatever's left cementing yourself as this. Silence on the line. 15 seconds. 20. Okay, he said. Kurt Brennan was in federal custody by 4:30 that same afternoon. Clifford's legal team had pulled the Chapter 11 filing at 2 p.m. By 3, the FBI had notified Adele's office that Clifford's cooperation was on record. I settled onto the back porch and watched the fading light leave the water. Cold air clean, carrying that distinctly early February quality, the smell of hard ground underfoot, and some faint tentative thing beneath it that hadn't decided yet to be spring. Sylvia had conceived every element of this arranged Every moving part held it together for 2 years. The decision about whether to release it or swing it open had fallen to me. I'd swung it open. I sat in the cold with that, turning it. Was it the right call? Was right, even the proper measure here, the right instrument to apply to a choice like this? Whether clear judgment and quiet surrender looked the same from the inside, I had no certain answer. What I could say was that I'd made the choice as myself, as the man who'd spent 40 years at a stove, as the man Sylvia had filmed through kitchen doorways and quietly said, "That's it." Just like that. For now, that had to hold. 2 days after Kurt Brennan was remanded to federal custody, Clifford phoned. Something had changed in him. His voice was lower, less assured. The Carew Tower district cadence he'd been wearing for nearly a decade had gone thin and uncertain. Standing at the kitchen window, I listened, and a thought moved through me. This is what it sounds like when the shell finally gives. I was mistaken. I would understand that later. He drove out to Loveland on a Thursday. No attorney riding with him this time, no folio under his arm, no car service. He came alone behind the wheel of something I didn't know. Plain, unremarkable, a rental. Or borrowed. Gray sweater jeans. On the porch he had the look of a man whose wardrobe of selves had finally run dry. I put on coffee. We took our seats at the kitchen table. For 2 hours he talked about Wharton, the private equity years, about Kurt Brennan, and how things between them had begun. Not a scheme from the start, he said. A friendship, the slow accruing kind, where favors and obligations pile up until the day you realize you've consented to things with no memory of consenting. He circled back to the phone call in 2021, the one Sylvia had picked up on. Just business, he'd told himself. He'd had a talent for that kind of self-instruction. He mentioned the dinner in 2012, the night he'd dismissed the restaurant as a pastime. He knew it was wrong in the moment, he said, and spoke the words anyway, because at 22, newly degreed and quietly frightened, admitting that his parents had built something genuine, would have forced him to measure himself against it. I was ashamed of the wrong things he said. I took it all in. No interruptions, no offered pardons. Sylvia had shown me long ago that the cruelest mercy you can offer someone in genuine pain is a quick escape from it. But I kept listening, and somewhere deep in that second hour, while his eyes stayed fixed on the tabletop, rather than my face, I noticed something settle, that particular hushed quality that moves in after anger exhausts itself and leaves something raw in its wake. He pushed back his chair at one point, said he needed air. 2 minutes. I moved to the stove, topped off the coffee, thought nothing of it. 2 minutes, more or less. The back door shut. Then it opened. I looked toward the little Miami River through the window while I waited my mind, drifting to a step stool, a chef's knife, and the small hands I'd once steadied with my own. He returned looking more collected. We kept at it until the light outside was gone. When he finally left, I watched his taillights fade along Riverview Drive, then stepped back inside and rang Adele. He came, I told her. He said things I believe he meant. File the formal letter of support. Make the case for leniency based on his cooperation. Handle it the right way. A beat of silence from her end. Are you sure about this? No, I said, but do it regardless. 10 days on Adele was calling before oat syrup in the morning. Arden had flagged something the previous evening. Her voice had settled into that exact measured register it assumed when the news was grave. A wire transfer had been initiated from a brokerage account linked to the Delaware LLC Stemfield Capital Partners. $2.3 million moved into a Cayman Islands account. She paused. The timestamp on the transfer matched the afternoon Clifford had been sitting in this house. I lowered myself into a chair. That afternoon, while he was here. Yes, Adele left it there without gloss. Arden had pulled Clifford's phone records from that day. The FBI held them under the Cooperation Monitoring Protocol and matched the timestamp precisely. At 3:47 p.m., during the window when Clifford had stepped outside for air, he'd placed a 40-second call to a number in Nassau. The transfer moved 18 minutes after that. Preset automated. The call was only the key in the lock. She let a silence open. He arranged it before he ever got in the car to come here. Loveland was the alibi. The visit bought him the window he needed for the money to move. I had nothing to say. Beyond the window, the little Miami River ran on. A red-tailed hawk was perched on the fence post at the edge of the garden, still against the gray February sky, its gaze fixed on something beyond my line of sight. He'd built all of it before he came. The gray sweater, the plain car, 2 hours of words I'd elected to believe because I had needed to believe them because I was 67 years old, and this was my son. And since 2012, I'd been searching for a version of him I could still reach. He'd known that. He'd counted on it. He'd occupied Sylvia's kitchen table in the house she'd made for me, stepped outside, made a 40-second call, and come back through the door looking steadier. I pressed the phone to my ear and registered something wholly new to this entire ordeal. Not grief, not the slow burn of anger, not even the particular sorrow of watching a son move toward wreckage you can't prevent. Something quieter and more final. The feeling that descends when you release the hope of a different ending and look squarely at the one you have. Send everything to the FBI, I said. All of it, the timestamp, the Nassau number, the Cayman account, Arden's full file. Every piece, Eugene, she said. Don't I told her. Send it. Federal agents took Clifford Varden into custody the next morning at Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport Terminal 1 at 6:52 a.m. He was standing at the United Airlines counter with a carry-on and a leather document case holding asset transfer agreements for 3 Miller's Express subsidiary accounts. Nassau, Bahamas, was his destination. Adele called to give me the news. I was on the back porch in my cold coffee in hand, watching the river move. I had held Sylvia's door open for him, the one she'd fashioned, set into her plan, not as a snare, but as a threshold, a passage out of the life he'd been constructing. He'd stepped through, taken stock, and bolted. I found myself thinking of a line from the letter Alvin Good had brought me. Whatever you decide to do with what's left of this, do it as yourself. I'd extended what was genuinely mine to offer, and when the evidence demanded to be sent, I'd sent it. Some people, I thought, and stopped there, leaving it to the river in the February cold. Some people aren't ready for the door when it opens. Perhaps they never become ready. I couldn't say whether that meant opening it had been right. The question may not have a clean floor to land on. I drained the cold coffee, went inside, put breakfast on. On the first Monday of April, outside the Loveland house, the Little Miami River had transformed overnight. That unmistakable turn from winter pewter to something green-tinged and living that early spring produces, when you aren't quite watching, until all at once you can't look away. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when the phone rang. "Eugene," she said, "are you ready to cook in front of a camera?" Across the room, the leather apron hung from its hook near the back door. I'd brought it out of the bedroom back in February, positioned where it could be close to the kitchen, which was where it belonged. Sunday mornings I'd been putting it on, not out of habit, exactly just because certain objects have rooms. They were always destined for, and wearing it felt like an acknowledgement of that. "Give me the address for the renovation crew at the Rusty Can," I said. "I have to see it before anything else." Reed Callum was waiting for me outside the building on a Tuesday morning, second week of April. Nothing about the facade had changed. Corrugated metal, weathered signage, that same stretch of West End carrying its particular April smell, wet soil and diesel, with something sweet drifting over from a bakery a couple of blocks away. Sylvia had gone through Adele's office to make her instructions clear. The exterior was off limits to the crew. Let it look like what it is she'd put in the renovation brief. The inside is the story. The inside was unrecognizable. Up on the upper floor, where I'd come across the seaming machines, and Sylvia's old desk and the iron floor, plate, everything had been torn out and rebuilt as a professional kitchen studio. The production lighting hung in place but hadn't been switched on, and the morning came through the cleaned skylights in the same pale rectangular patches it always had. Only now those patches fell on surfaces that justified them. I stopped just inside the entrance. The walls were the original industrial brick, not replaced, just cleaned, and repointed the mortar, fresh against stone that had been there for decades. The color was a warm red. I knew the way you know a voice in another room before you can place who it belongs to. Along the north wall, open steel shelving with adjustable brackets, arranged exactly as I'd arranged shelving in every kitchen I'd run over the years, the same layout because it worked, and I'd had no cause to alter it. The stove sat centered on the south wall, so that whoever stood cooking faced outward into the room. I had cooked at a stove in that exact position, in a room nearly that precise size in a kitchen on Vine Street in 1988. Our first restaurant, the one Sylvia and I had pulled together from the catering work, the one we'd launched on a Thursday evening, with 12 tables and a menu she'd drafted on a legal pad and a queue at the door that surprised us both, even though neither of us would have admitted we'd been hoping for it. The brick, the same warm red, the shelving, the same layout, the stove, the same wall, the same angle to the room. Sylvia hadn't renovated the rusty can. She had reconstructed 1988. Reed stayed quiet while I took it in. He had a gift for reading silences, for knowing when presence was enough and words would only intrude. After a few minutes, I crossed to the stove and laid my palm flat against the cold iron of the nearest burner and let it rest there. Then I pulled on the apron. I'd packed it from Loveland that morning, not with any intention of wearing it here, but because it had become one of those things that simply traveled with me now, woven into the ordinary movements of my days. I fastened the strings at the front the way Sylvia had always done hers, rather than crossing them back. She'd explained it to me once as the more sensible method, and she'd been correct, and I'd tied them that way ever since. My hand went into the front pocket. Something was there, a folded sheet, heavier stock than ordinary paper, the kind of recipe card Sylvia had written on for 40 years, because lighter paper near a flame made her nervous. I opened it. Saffron Rosado. Her writing the earlier form of it, that firm, slanted hand from the years before the illness began to take the precision from her fingers. The recipe was one I could have recited without looking, had carried in my head for decades, but she'd written every step out regardless, and alongside the steps, the margin notes she added when the writing was meant to guide someone else. Small arrows flagging the timing-sensitive moments. One note about the saffron bloom, longer than you think you need to. Patience is the whole point. At the card's bottom, below the last line of the recipe, in a different ink, written at some later moment, start here. You always start with what you know best. I stood in the kitchen she had built for me, holding the card she had tucked into the pocket of an apron she'd kept safe for 26 years. There was a feeling that came with it of being precisely placed in a location and a life and a particular unfolding that I hadn't known since before September. The first episode went before the camera on a Wednesday in the third week of April. Claudia brought a crew of 4, tight and economical in the way she handled everything. The deal with Meridian Food Network had closed in March 24th, episodes working title Eugene's Table, framed around technique and memory. A major food distributor had come in during negotiations with a licensing arrangement that added a financial dimension Claudia walked me through. The details I left largely in Reed and Adele's hands. What I grasped clearly was that the figures made sense. The project had substance, and Sylvia had been setting it all in motion 22 months before I had any idea it was there. The first morning, the kitchen filled with butter and saffron stock, easing along on the rear burner, arose, going golden in the pan. Something shifted in me that I hadn't prepared for. Memory wasn't quite the word for it. It was closer to the sensation of a key finding its notches, that quiet, entirely bodily click when the mechanism aligns below the reach of conscious thought. Butter going. Brown saffron, opening in warm fat. That was the smell of every kitchen where I had ever built anything that mattered. The first rented kitchen over on Freeman Avenue, where Sylvia would say, more basil. Eugene, always, more basil. The Vine Street restaurant in 1988. Sunday mornings in the Indian Hill House. The catering years in Norwood. Every origin point folded into a single compound of heat and fat and spice, and the slow work of patience. It wasn't one morning I was reaching back toward. It was the reason behind all of them. Why we'd started. Why we'd kept at it. Why Sylvia had given 2 years of what remained of her life to making sure there would still be something to keep at after she was no longer there to keep at it with me. Standing at that stove, I didn't arrive at. Understanding through reasoning, it arrived through the body, the way cold air registers on the skin before the mind names a temperature. "Ready?" Claudia called out from behind the camera. Her tone carried warmth and steadiness and no urgency at all. Someone who recognized the weight of the moment and was content to hold the space open around it. I looked down at the slanted letters on Sylvia's card, the small arrows, the margin notes. Start here. You always start with what you know best. My hand found the ladle. Ready, I thought. for the first time in a very long time, genuinely, without hedging, without the small interior asterisk I'd grown used to attaching to everything. I was ready. The final episode wrapped on the last Thursday of September, exactly a year from the night I'd stood outside this same building in the dark quay, rested no other destination in mind. I didn't observe the anniversary in any formal sense. There was no gesture, no speech. When Claudia called cut on the last setup of the last episode, I killed the flame, put down the spoon, and unknotted the apron strings, exactly as I'd knotted them at the start of each of the 6 months of shooting days. The crew began pulling down the lighting rig. Music came on from somewhere. The kitchen held the smell of what I'd made last, a brown butter thyme sauce over handmade gnocchi that bore no connection to that episode's subject, but felt like the correct thing to cook on a day that was also a kind of ending. Sylvia would have understood that reasoning. Reed had carried most of the licensing negotiation with Adele, going over the contract terms. Everything was finalized in August, a 15-year agreement covering the 5 USPTO registered formulations, the Eugene's table brand, and the associated recipe methodology. $2.1 million per year paid quarterly into the Varden Family Living Trust. Reed had phoned the morning the countersigned documents arrived and read the figure to me twice to be certain it had landed. It had. I didn't yet know what to make of it, which Reed said was a perfectly reasonable place to be, and that there was no urgency in working it out. What was clear to me was this: Sylvia had spent 40 years constructing something. I had spent those same 40 years beside her in that work, mostly without grasping the full dimensions of what we were assembling together. The licensing agreement wasn't the heart of any of it, but it was a kind of measure, a particular confirmation that what she had believed about the worth of what we'd built was simply true, and that the people who had tried to dismiss it as a pastime or move it below cost to a Delaware LLC had been wrong from the start. I drove back to Loveland the afternoon we wrapped. The expressway was unchanged, as expressways always are. The skyline shrank in the mirror behind me as the land flattened and opened going west. The Little Miami River came into view ahead, the way a familiar landmark does when you've learned to read a route by it. The trees lining Riverview Drive had gone full autumn color gold and red in the slant of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes a person understand why October in the Midwest has generated so much written about it. Betty was raking leaves in her front yard when I turned in. She lifted a hand and came to the fence while I was pulling my bag from the car, moving with the particular economy of a woman who has concluded that at 70, the social courtesies that slow down honest exchange aren't worth what they cost. "How did the last day go?" she asked. "Well, I said I made gnocchi." She gave a nod that suggested this was the right kind of answer. Then after a beat, "Have you heard anything from Clifford?" I set the bag down on the porch step. It wasn't a question that caught me unguarded. Betta May had never trafficked in indirection about the things she genuinely wanted to know. That directness was one of the qualities I'd come to value in her. Besides, I'd had 6 months to find my footing with an answer. He made his choices, I said. I made mine. She studied me for a moment with the careful look of someone deciding whether a person has actually arrived somewhere or is simply describing the destination. Whatever she concluded, she appeared to accept it. "Come for dinner this week," she said. "I've made too much soup." "Thursday," I said. She went back to her leaves. I went inside. The kitchen was as I'd left it, clean and quiet, carrying the particular settled stillness that comes to a room after it has held someone's habits, long enough to absorb them into the walls. I put the kettle on and stood at the window watching the river for a while. The water was moving more slowly, now heavier, with autumn going about the serious work of the season with the unhurried patience of something that has no need to rush, because it has been making this same passage for longer than anyone can account for. When I turned from the window, I noticed the chair. It sat where I'd left it, beside the wall, near the table, angled slightly more forward than it had been in August, as though it had shifted a few inches toward the room while I was away. I stood and looked at it. The place it left empty at the table was the same one it had always left empty. That hadn't changed. I'd had no expectation that it would. I thought about moving it flush against the wall, tidying the geometry of the table back into something symmetrical. The kettle was beginning to sound behind me, and I held that thought for a long moment. Then I left the chair where it was. There are things you don't put away because putting them away amounts to a kind of untruth. a false assertion that the absence they mark is correctable, temporary something that will eventually sort itself into orderly furniture and full tables. The chair was none of those things. It was accurate. It was an honest record of who was meant to be sitting there and wasn't. And I had been around long enough to know that accuracy carries more weight than symmetry. The kettle went quiet. I made the tea. I sat at the table in my usual place with the river beyond the window and the October light coming in at a slant, the empty chair at the edge of my sight present without demanding, the way certain people go on being present even after everything. There are chairs that stay empty, Sylvia, I thought, not only as grief as acknowledgement, but that doesn't make the table any less full. I drank the tea. The afternoon eased toward evening. The chair stayed where it was. For the first time in a long time, for the first time perhaps, since a Tuesday morning in September of the year before when I had stood in our living room watching a version of the future I'd taken for granted. Dissolve, I recognized what I was feeling as something ordinary, not healed, not resolved, not the clean conclusion that grief is supposed to arrive at if you navigate it correctly. Just ordinary. A man, a kitchen, a cup of tea, the river, doing what rivers do outside the window. It was enough. It was, I thought, precisely what Sylvia had been working toward all along. Eugene's Table, Episode 1, aired on a Wednesday evening, October 8th, 2024. Exactly 1 year and 3 weeks from the night I'd stood outside that building with a rusted key in my hand and a son who had decided it was the most worthless object in the world. I hadn't intended to watch it with anyone, but Reed called Monday. Claudia called Tuesday. Betty turned up Thursday to ask what she should bring, which settled the question of whether I wanted company, without my having had to answer it. Phyllis Taggart drove in from the South Side Wednesday afternoon, the first time we'd been in the same room after 9 months of phone calls. She was smaller than I'd pictured and steadier. When she took my hand, she said simply, "I'm glad he's all right." She meant me. I believed her. We gathered in the studio at 7:30. Reed carried in folding chairs. Claudia brought wine. Bet brought pie because Bet always brought something and had long since concluded that pie suited most occasions a position I had come to share entirely. I set up the playback screen Claudia's crew had left mounted on the north wall. I hadn't watched a single complete episode since the filming. Tonight felt different from those private viewings. Tonight it had become real. At 8 hour, the title card came up. Eugene's Table. Then the studio kitchen, the one Sylvia had designed to look like 1988, lit in the pale light of an April morning. And then myself, at the stove in the leather apron reaching for a pan. My wife always said I cooked for everyone except myself. My voice unhurried. She wasn't wrong, but she fixed that too. Bet made a small sound beside me, not crying, something quieter than that. Recognition. I watched myself move through the kitchen, familiar and remote at once, like coming across a letter you wrote years ago and finding you still stand behind every word of it. The man on the screen worked through that kitchen with the ease of someone who has done this for 50 years and has finally let go of the waiting, waiting for permission, waiting for the right moment, waiting for whatever invisible clearance he'd imagined he needed. Claudia refilled my glass without my noticing. Reed didn't say a word the entire hour, which was how I knew he thought it was good. Phyllis watched with quiet attention, and at one point, when the camera settled on my hands, at the cutting board, she pressed her lips together briefly in the way that means something that doesn't have a name. Everyone was gone by 10:15. Bet last, taking her time, the way someone does when they're making sure a person is genuinely all right, and not only performing it. She held me in her gaze for a moment with the full weight of 70 years of reading people, found what she needed, kissed me on the cheek, said good, and walked next door. I went back inside and began washing the glasses. The studio held the warm residue of the evening voices gone, but not entirely absent, the way rooms carry people briefly after they leave. I moved through the closing routine I'd run 10,000 times, wipe the counters, stack the chairs, fold away the cloths, the work that asks only your hands and leaves your mind alone. I opened the lowest drawer of the prep station to put away a dish towel. Near the back was a note folded once written on recipe cardstock. I recognized the paper before I opened it. I knew the handwriting before I reached the words. I knew you'd find your way back to a kitchen, Eugene. You always do. Save me a seat at the table. G. I stood alone in the empty studio and held that note for a long time. Then I folded it with care and put it in my breast pocket close. I turned to face the long prep table at the center of the room, 6 chairs pushed evenly along its length. I drew one out from the left side and set it slightly apart from the others, straightened it, stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then I turned on the stove. I don't know how long I cooked. Long enough for warmth to settle through the studio and the smell of something making itself slowly the way good things always do. No recipe, no particular destination, nobody to cook for, or nobody I could see, which I'd learned by then was a meaningful distinction. Beyond the walls of the rusty can Cincinnati was being October, that hard wind pushing up from the Ohio River, the sky gone the flat gray of old pewter, something in the atmosphere announcing itself as finished and turning. Inside the picture was simpler. A man standing at a stove, a chair left empty at the table, and 43 years of love that had never once depended on a lock to hold it. Sylvia had always known as much. If you've stayed with me to the end of the story, I want to thank you for that. It is not a short one, and it is not a light one, but I think you already knew it wouldn't be. What I carried out of that building, out of every part of what Sylvia had quietly built over 4 decades, was this: love at its most steady is not loud. It does not announce itself. It works in the background, in careful silence, over years and years, so that when the people it protects need it most, it is simply there. It cost her everything to build what she built, and I believe God gave her the clarity and the time to finish it, even when the time she had was running out. Here is what I would want anyone to take from this. Build something worth protecting, and then protect it quietly. Not with anger, but with patience and precision. If someone in your life is working to diminish what you made together, document everything. The truth recorded carefully outlasts any single confrontation. Never confuse a person's silence for surrender. The quietest people in the room are often the ones who have already thought 10 steps ahead. And if someone saves a seat for you at the table, even long after they are gone, find a way to sit down. If this story moved you, I hope you'll leave a thought in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy right now, someone who needs to hear that love can be this patient, this deliberate, this fierce, please share this with them. Subscribe to Family Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.